September 2006. The Department of Homeland Security approached FedEx with an unusual proposal. They wanted to turn their cargo planes into something that had never existed before: commercial aircraft with military-grade missile defense systems. FedEx agreed. They installed these systems on 10 aircraft, and for over a year, these planes flew thousands of flights across the globe, each one equipped with sensors that could detect a missile launch from miles away, and lasers powerful enough to blind the weapon mid-flight. The technology worked. American Airlines joined the program. 3 of their passenger jets, flying regular routes with paying customers, were equipped with the same defensive systems. Then, in 2007, both airlines did something shocking. They ripped every single system off their planes, scrapped the entire program, walked away from millions in government investment. The systems weren't failures. They worked exactly as designed. But something about operating them in the real world of commercial aviation made them impossible to keep. For a decade, the program was considered dead, but in October 2019, FedEx filed a new request with the FAA. They wanted to install missile defense systems again. The same technology, the same Guardian pods they'd abandoned 12 years earlier. But this time, something was different. They weren't asking for government funding. Instead, FedEx was willing to pay for everything themselves, millions of dollars per aircraft, across their entire fleet, for a system they'd already proven was operationally impossible in commercial aviation. So why does FedEx want to install anti-missile defense systems on its airplanes again? On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the world watched in horror as commercial airliners became weapons of mass destruction. The attacks fundamentally altered the trajectory of American aviation, but the consequences extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. The US government quickly realized that the downing of commercial aircraft by terrorists represented not just a catastrophic loss of life, but an existential threat to the nation's economic stability. The aftermath revealed costs that extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The direct economic impact was measured in billions, as the aviation industry came to a complete halt. Airlines hemorrhaged money with every hour their fleets sat idle, but the indirect costs proved even more catastrophic. In the weeks and months following the attacks, passenger numbers plummeted as fear gripped the nation. People were simply too traumatized to fly. The resulting downturn rippled through the entire economy, affecting hotels, restaurants, tourism, and countless businesses dependent on air travel. Insurance claims skyrocketed, lawsuits multiplied. The psychological toll manifested in measurable economic damage that would persist for years. The US government understood that restoring confidence in air travel was paramount. Their response was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 months, Congress established the Transportation Security Administration, a new federal agency tasked with securing all modes of transportation. Airports transformed into fortified checkpoints, with passengers subjected to rigorous screening procedures that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Cockpit doors were reinforced and locked, creating an impenetrable barrier between passengers and flight crews. Federal air marshals began flying undercover on commercial flights, armed and ready to neutralize any threat. But there was a fundamental limitation to this approach. These protections only extended as far as US jurisdiction. Once an aircraft departed American airspace, it entered a world where the United States had no control over ground-level threats. In many parts of the world, a different kind of danger was proliferating, one capable of devastating commercial aviation with minimal effort and resources. And that's exactly what happened. On November 22, 2003, an Airbus A300 cargo aircraft operated by DHL Express climbed into the morning sky above Baghdad International Airport. The flight was routine, part of the daily logistics operation supporting the massive reconstruction effort in post-invasion Iraq. But approximately 2 minutes after takeoff, at an altitude of just 8,000 feet, a streak of fire erupted from the ground below. A shoulder-fired missile accelerated toward the ascending aircraft, its heat-seeking warhead locked onto the blazing signature of the plane's engines. The impact was catastrophic. The missile struck the left wing, tearing through hydraulic lines and fuel systems. Instantly, the crew lost control of the aircraft's primary flight surfaces. Warning alarms screamed in the cockpit as hydraulic pressure dropped to zero. What followed was a desperate 15-minute battle for survival, as the three-man crew attempted the seemingly impossible, landing a massive cargo jet with no hydraulics, using only differential engine thrust to maintain some semblance of control. Against all odds, the crew managed to safely land at Baghdad International Airport, displaying extraordinary airmanship. The aircraft was destroyed, but the crew lived to tell the world exactly what had attacked them. A weapon that was about to fundamentally reshape the security calculus for commercial aviation worldwide. The weapon was called a MANPADS, an acronym for Man-Portable Air Defense System. These shoulder-fired missiles represented a nightmare scenario for aviation security experts. Unlike the sophisticated hijacking plot that required months of planning and coordination, MANPADS attacks were disturbingly simple. The weapons were portable, often weighing less than 50 pounds. They were relatively inexpensive, with black market prices ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars. Most critically, they required minimal training to operate effectively. Point the launcher at an aircraft, wait for the infrared seeker to lock onto the heat signature of the engines, and pull the trigger. The proliferation of these weapons accelerated dramatically following the Cold War's end. Massive military stockpiles, particularly from the former Soviet Union, leaked into the global arms black market. Conflict zones across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia became saturated with these weapons. Terrorist organizations and insurgent groups gained access to military-grade anti-aircraft capabilities without needing nation-state support. The threat was no longer theoretical. The statistics were chilling. Since 1975, more than 60 civilian aircraft had been shot down by MANPADS attacks, resulting in over 1,000 deaths. Each incident represented not just a tragedy, but a potential trigger for the kind of systemic collapse that 9/11 had demonstrated. A 2005 study by the RAND Corporation estimated that the direct cost of each civilian aircraft downed by a MANPADS attack would approach $1 billion. When accounting for the aircraft, litigation, compensation, and investigation costs. But the indirect costs would dwarf even that staggering figure. The psychological impact, the immediate grounding of flights, the weeks or months of depressed passenger demand, all of these factors would compound into economic damage far exceeding the direct losses. The DHL incident in Baghdad crystallized the threat. Congress recognized that the elaborate security apparatus protecting domestic aviation was completely ineffective against this particular danger. In response, the US Congress directed the Department of Homeland Security to develop and implement a comprehensive plan for protecting commercial aircraft from MANPADS attacks. The resulting initiative became known as the Counter-MANPADS Program, an ambitious initiative that sought to bring proven military defensive technology into the civilian aviation sector. This represented a fundamental shift in approach. Rather than simply accepting vulnerability, the program aimed to give commercial aircraft the same missile defense capabilities that military transport planes had used for years. However, there was a problem. You see, military systems operated under very different constraints than commercial aviation. They could tolerate higher failure rates, accept greater weight and complexity, and didn't need to comply with civilian airworthiness standards, or operate profitably. The challenge facing the Counter-MANPADS program was adapting this battle-tested technology to meet the stringent requirements of commercial aviation. The Department of Homeland Security partnered with two of America's most prominent defense contractors to tackle this challenge. BAE Systems and Northrop Grumman each developed distinct approaches to the problem, both based on similar underlying principles, but implementing them in different ways. BAE Systems developed a system called Jet-Eye, a distributed architecture where components were installed across different sections of the aircraft. Sensors, processors, and countermeasure emitters were strategically positioned to provide comprehensive coverage around the entire aircraft. This approach offered redundancy and flexibility, but required more extensive modifications to the aircraft structure. Northrop Grumman took a different path with their Guardian system. Rather than distributing components throughout the aircraft, Guardian packaged everything into a self-contained pod that could be mounted to the underside of the fuselage. This pod-based approach simplified installation and maintenance, potentially making it more attractive to airlines concerned about operational complexity. Despite their architectural differences, both systems operated on the same fundamental principle. They employed sophisticated sensors to detect the launch signature and track the incoming missile's trajectory. Once a threat was confirmed, the systems directed a powerful infrared laser beam at the approaching weapon. This laser didn't physically destroy the missile. Instead, it exploited a critical vulnerability in the missile's guidance system. MANPADS, like most heat-seeking missiles, use infrared sensors to track the thermal signature emitted by an aircraft's engines. The sensor locks onto this heat source and continuously adjusts the missile's trajectory to maintain contact until impact. To counter this, the countermeasure laser floods the sensor with an overwhelming burst of infrared energy, essentially blinding the missile's guidance system. It was an elegant solution that leveraged the missile's own technology against itself. Following successful testing and evaluation, both systems moved toward operational deployment. BAE Systems installed Jet-Eye on 3 American Airlines Boeing 767 passenger aircraft. These were active commercial flights, carrying paying passengers on regularly scheduled routes. Northrop Grumman's Guardian pods were installed on 10 FedEx MD-11 cargo aircraft, which operated on both domestic and international routes. For over a year, these aircraft flew with active missile defense systems, accumulating thousands of flight hours and operational data. However, there were serious problems with these systems that airlines didn't fully consider at the time of installation. You see, while the systems could successfully neutralize missile threats during testing, they suffered from a critical flaw that made them nearly impossible to operate in a commercial aviation environment: reliability. The data collected over 16,000 flight hours revealed a disturbing pattern. Despite Guardian and Jet-Eye demonstrating effective threat neutralization when functioning properly, both systems experienced system failures and errors at rates far exceeding what was acceptable for commercial aviation. Every time one of these defensive systems experienced a malfunction or error, it triggered a maintenance event that created cascading operational headaches. The systems were highly complex, requiring specially trained technicians specifically approved and certified by either BAE Systems or Northrop Grumman to work on these systems. This created immediate bottlenecks in maintenance operations. The specialized nature of these repairs meant longer maintenance times. An aircraft that should have been back in service within hours might sit grounded for days, waiting for an approved technician to arrive. This wreaked havoc on flight schedules and crew assignments. The additional maintenance burden translated directly into increased operational costs. Airlines had to pay premium rates for the specialized technicians, cover the costs of keeping aircraft grounded longer, and absorb the revenue losses from cancelled flights. Perhaps most frustrating, the operational reality meant FedEx often found itself flying aircraft within operational defense systems. The systems had failed, but the aircraft was still airworthy and needed for scheduled flights, so planes took off with defensive equipment that provided no actual protection, defeating the entire purpose of the installation. Cost considerations compounded these reliability problems. Each system installation carried a price tag of approximately $1 million per aircraft. This represented an enormous capital expenditure, particularly for airlines operating on the notoriously thin profit margins that characterize the commercial aviation industry. Many carriers struggled to achieve profitability even in the best circumstances. Some operated at a loss during economic downturns or periods of high fuel costs. Adding $1 million expense per aircraft for a defensive system that frequently malfunctioned was financially untenable. But the cost implications extended beyond the initial installation. The additional weight and aerodynamic drag from mounting these systems had measurable impacts on fuel efficiency. For some of the longest international routes, this degradation in performance was sufficient to make certain routes unprofitable, or in extreme cases, technically unfeasible. This created a competitive imbalance. American Airlines and FedEx found themselves at a disadvantage compared to their rivals. They were burning more fuel, facing higher maintenance costs, and dealing with greater operational complexity, all while competing against airlines that faced none of these burdens. Moreover, there was another major problem. Guardian and Jet-Eye incorporated military-grade technology that fell squarely under the United States Munitions List, a regulatory framework governing the export of defense-related equipment and information. According to these regulations, when an aircraft equipped with such systems departed United States airspace, that action constituted an export of the technology. Such exports were strictly prohibited without explicit authorization through export licenses issued by the State Department. This created a massive operational problem for both airlines, which depended heavily on international routes for profitability. When aircraft with these defensive systems required maintenance at foreign airports, the situation became legally complex. Providing technical documentation, system specifications, or maintenance procedures to these foreign facilities and their employees also constituted technology export under the regulations. Each instance required separate export licensing approval, turning the entire situation into a nightmare. Given these circumstances, FedEx and American Airlines had no choice but to remove the defensive systems from their aircraft. After just 1 year of operational testing, both companies concluded that the technology, despite its proven effectiveness against threats, was simply incompatible with commercial aviation operations. The systems were uninstalled, and the counter MANPADS program quietly faded from public view. That might have been the end of the story. But then, in October 2019, FedEx shocked the aviation industry when they applied for a supplemental type certificate to install laser-based missile defense systems once again. The proposed system was similar to the Guardian pods tested over a decade earlier, but this time FedEx announced they would bear the entire financial burden themselves, rather than relying on government subsidies. But why would FedEx want to install technology it abandoned a decade ago? The answer lies in understanding how the global security environment had evolved. While these defensive systems remained disadvantageous under normal operational circumstances, the geopolitical landscape of the late 2010s was anything but normal. Regional conflicts and failed states created ungoverned spaces where terrorist groups operated freely. The proliferation of advanced weapons, including MANPADS, had accelerated rather than diminished. In this volatile environment, the strategic advantages these systems offered to FedEx suddenly outweighed the operational costs. One critical advantage was exclusive access to restricted airspace. When conflicts erupt or security threats emerge, aviation authorities typically impose flight restrictions or outright bans on commercial operations. A stark example occurred in May of this year, when a missile struck near Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. The FAA immediately prohibited all US airline flights to Israel. Every American carrier was forced to cancel service, losing millions in revenue with no recourse. They simply couldn't fly into what regulators deemed a dangerous environment. Israeli carrier El Al, however, continued normal operations immediately after the crisis. Their aircraft were equipped with missile defense systems, giving them regulatory approval to operate in high-risk environments that other carriers couldn't access. FedEx recognized the competitive advantage this represented. If their cargo aircraft could potentially maintain operations in markets where competitors were banned from flying, being the only carrier operating becomes extraordinarily valuable. This capability aligned perfectly with another strategic objective: securing lucrative military and government contracts. The United States military and government agencies require cargo delivery services to conflict zones and high-risk areas worldwide. These contracts offer premium pricing that reflects the inherent dangers, and they provide substantial, consistent cargo volume. During major military operations, civilian contractors transport the vast majority of military cargo that doesn't require military transport aircraft. FedEx, with missile defense-equipped aircraft, could position itself as the preferred contractor for high-risk logistics operations that other civilian carriers couldn't safely undertake. Moreover, this defense system also acts as a risk mitigator while reducing the insurance premiums on the cargo. So in January 2022, on behalf of FedEx, the FAA filed a proposal with the US Department of Transportation seeking special conditions for laser installations. The proposal outlined technical specifications, operational parameters, and safety protocols for the system. It appeared the regulatory path forward was finally materializing. But only 2 days later, the FAA abruptly withdrew the proposal, citing the need for further internal study and to avoid confusion to the public. The reversal revealed the complex challenges these systems still presented. Laser systems exist at the intersection of multiple regulatory domains. The FDA must approve and classify the lasers themselves. The FAA must certify them and authorize their operation on commercial aircraft. There are legitimate safety concerns. What happens if a laser directs energy toward unintended targets? And what are the implications if the system alerts the crew mid-takeoff or landing, which adds to cockpit workload in critical flight phases? They're scenarios that need further research before commercial implementation. However, the FAA's withdrawal wasn't a rejection. Instead, it was a deferral. The FAA's language suggested they recognized the legitimacy of FedEx's proposal, but needed more time to develop appropriate regulatory frameworks. Looking forward, anti-missile defense systems may become increasingly common in commercial aviation, particularly for cargo carriers and airlines serving regions with persistent security challenges. As global tensions show no signs of decreasing, what seemed impractical a decade ago may become standard equipment in the near future. FedEx isn't pursuing this technology out of paranoia or military enthusiasm. They're making a calculated business decision based on evolving global realities. In an industry defined by thin margins and intense competition, this defense system is more of a necessity than an amenity.